Have you ever gone through an experience that completely rattled you? Something so intense that every tiny detail around you from that moment remains crystal clear, even years later? I can still vividly recall the exact second I realized something was seriously wrong with me. It was my junior year of high school, just another ordinary day sitting in Mr. Thompson's history class. I remember the distinct smell of erasers mixed with the faint scent of cheap cologne coming from the guy sitting next to me. The scratchy tag on my t-shirt was driving me crazy, and I was trying hard not to rip it off right there in class. Mr. Thompson was talking about the fall of Constantinople, but my mind was elsewhere. My mouth was dry, and I kept sneaking glances at the clock, counting down the minutes until lunch so I could grab a soda. Behind me, the repetitive click of a pen matched the tune that was stuck in my head. All these sensations were swirling in my mind simultaneously. My ADHD brain was racing 1,000,000 miles per hour when suddenly, everything came to a screeching halt at exactly 11:23. I felt something like a hand gripping the inside of my stomach. It didn't hurt per se, but that's not why I was terrified. You see, I don't just deal with ADHD. I also have OCD, which makes me fear anything growing or moving inside me. Even the thought of blood circulating or my heart beating forces me to distract myself with other ideas. I've had full-blown panic attacks because of this. The closest term is tocophobia, which technically means the fear of pregnancy. I'm a guy, so it's not entirely accurate, but it's the closest fit. I do have a deep fear of pregnancy, not of me being pregnant, obviously, but even knowing I couldn't get pregnant, the mere thought still makes me feel sick. Imagine the sheer terror that washed over me as I sensed something moving inside. I let out a groan and grabbed my stomach. Instantly, the whole class turned to look at me, and even Mr. Thompson paused his lecture to ask if I was okay. Without responding, I stood up and bolted toward the nurse's office, ignoring his concern. My first thought wasn't that something was physically inside me. I'd felt stomach aches and gurgling before that made me uneasy, but I didn't have anything with me to help, unfortunately. The nurse always did. I dashed across the school, praying that my stomach wouldn't betray me again before I reached the office. Turning the corner, I entered the nurse's office, my tennis shoes squeaking loudly. There was Nurse Laura sitting on the couch, engrossed in a magazine. She looked up and smiled warmly, but her expression quickly shifted to concern. "Jake, what's going on? How can I help you?" she asked, standing up and hurrying over to me. She placed her hand gently over mine, which were tightly clutching my stomach. It's my stomach. Something's not right," I mumbled, my face flushed red. She walked over to her large medicine cabinet and motioned for me to sit down. Nurse Laura began asking about my symptoms, whether I was feeling pain, grumbling, cramps, nausea, and so forth. As she probed and searched through her bottles, the unsettling sensation returned. This time, it felt like fingers were grazing the inside of my body. I screamed and wrapped my arms around my torso. Nurse Laura rushed to comfort me. "This seems much worse than usual. Maybe we should call your parents," she suggested, placing her hand on my back. There were days when I saw Nurse Laura more often than my teachers. Any minor issue would distract me so badly that I had to see her, sometimes multiple times a day. She knew when something was truly wrong. Within about 30 minutes, both of my parents arrived with us. That might seem quick, but as an only child, my parents are very attuned to my needs. They know I can spiral and prefer to be around when it happens. They kept asking me where the pain was. I think they assumed that my lack of response meant the pain was excruciating. The truth was, I just didn't know how to explain what was happening. Frustration built up as they kept asking the same questions, and eventually I lost it and yelled at them. "Something is inside me! Get it out! Get it out! Get it out!" I tore at my shirt, leaving red scratches and cuts on my stomach. My mom and dad rushed to either side of me to hold my arms. Nurse Laura had seen me have meltdowns before, but this was the worst I had ever been in front of her. My parents, however, had dealt with similar situations. Not exactly like this, but they didn't hesitate to help. "Jake, breathe, sweetie. Remember, everything is inside you for a reason. It's keeping you alive. Nothing is going to hurt you," my mom said softly, using words my therapist had given her to calm me down. "Ice cubes! Get him ice cubes!" she instructed Nurse Laura as I began to hyperventilate. Nurse Laura grabbed a Ziploc bag and started filling it with ice cubes. My mom went over, took an ice cube from the bag, opened my hand, and placed it in it. This had worked before to distract me. I knew that's what she was doing, and honestly, I wanted it to work too, but this felt different. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a new feeling, that something couldn't physically be inside me. But I couldn't shake it. Everyone in the room could see things were escalating. I think they assumed it was just another mental breakdown, and that nothing was physically wrong, but I didn't care. I just needed help. My parents helped me into the car, with my mom even sitting in the back seat with me. She kept trying to distract me with conversation, but my mind was fixated on that terrible feeling in my stomach. We pulled up to the ER, and my mom guided me inside while holding both my wrists. It felt like she was walking me on a leash, but I didn't resist. I knew she was just trying to prevent me from scratching my stomach. We walked in, and I spoke to the receptionist. All I said was that I had terrible pain in my stomach. I didn't want to seem too crazy. I just needed a doctor to check whatever was going on. After giving the receptionist my name and insurance information, we went to sit down. I was seated between my parents and noticed my mom leaning back, trying to mouth something to my dad without me seeing. I didn't think much of it. I was too worried about other things. My dad then approached the receptionist, pointing over to me, and she looked a bit concerned. I saw her pick up the clipboard with my information and start writing something else on it. I asked my dad what he was doing, and he simply said not to worry, and that he wanted to let her know it was urgent. Within no more than 10 minutes, I felt a terrible moving sensation. I cringed and grabbed my stomach, immediately followed by not just the feeling of a hand gripping my insides, but also scratching and pinching. I yelled out in pain as the other people in the waiting room looked at me, horrified. A doctor and a couple of nurses rushed over to me and helped me up, but I couldn't stand. The pain was too intense. They placed me in a wheelchair and started heading to a room. However, they didn't take me through the usual big ER doors leading to the standard examination rooms. Instead, they guided my parents and me through a smaller door on the side with a padlock on it. We walked down a quiet, white hallway. The doctor and nurses showed us to my room and helped me into the bed as I was wiggling and wincing. I had one parent on each side of me, patiently holding my arms to prevent me from scratching. The doctor tried to ask more questions, but he could tell it wasn't leading anywhere. I knew my dad had probably informed the receptionist about my OCD tendencies, and that I needed to go to the psych ward, not just the regular ER section. I couldn't take it anymore and blurted out that something was inside my stomach and trying to get out. The doctor glanced at my parents for a reaction, and they gave him a sad nod, as if they had warned him this could happen. The doctor didn't just think I was crazy, my parents did too. He took a deep breath and approached me. I braced myself for some kind of dismissive speech about how this was just my OCD, and that everything would be okay. As he got closer, I pulled up my shirt, and he gasped. Not only was my stomach scratched up badly, but we could also see movement inside. It looked similar to when a pregnant woman sees her baby kicking, but this was much more intense. It was stretching my skin. My parents stood up and gasped, while the doctor looked frantic and unprepared. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" the doctor shouted as he backed away from the room. "Hold on! We're taking care of this. Just stay calm." Moments later, a nurse entered to administer some painkillers. As the ache began to dull, something far more terrifying started to take hold. I heard a voice, not my own, and not the creepy kind either, but that of a normal-sounding man I didn't recognize. But that wasn't the scariest part. What was truly frightening was what he was saying to me. "Get me out! Get me out! Get me out!" The voice began calmly, but quickly escalated to a frantic and demanding tone. It perfectly matched the sensations inside me. The voice grew so loud that I could barely hear the people around me. A few minutes after the doctor had left, he returned, looking exhausted and flushed, as if he'd just completed a marathon. He explained that they needed to run a few more tests on whatever was inside me before they could proceed. I tried desperately to focus on his words, but all I could hear was that persistent voice. It paused briefly, and then changed its message. "Cut me out! Cut me out! Cut me out, now!" I realized whatever was inside me wasn't just trying to escape, it wanted out immediately. I begged the doctor to remove it right away, but he didn't respond. The voice spoke again. "This is taking too long. Don't be afraid. Get me out yourself." I felt like it could sense my resistance. Without realizing it, I started scanning the room for something. It was as if I had no control over my head or eyes anymore. I knew the voice was searching for a knife, but I tried to ignore the sensation, convinced there were no knives nearby. I was in a safe place. Just when I thought I was safe, that feeling vanished instantly. The thought crossed my mind that my dad might have a pocket knife on him. My heart sank. I knew this thing could hear my thoughts and understand what it wanted to do. Suddenly, I found myself on my feet, lunging toward my dad. My body collided with his, but luckily, he was in good shape and managed to restrain me. He pinned me to the ground while I could barely hear my mom in the background, shouting at him to be careful. My dad understood something was wrong and knew I needed to stay grounded until I calmed down. My body tried to struggle, but it was futile. Meanwhile, the voice in my head escalated into yelling and screaming, not forming any clear words, just like a tantrum. What made my dad uneasy was the persistent kicking sensation in my stomach. After a few minutes, the voice quieted down, and I regained control of my body. My dad slowly stood up and tried to help me, but by then, the hospital staff seemed ready to take me for more tests. As I stood up straight, the voice surged back, and I lost all control of my body. I felt like an empty shell. My dad gave me a soft, worried smile, and in that instant, I grabbed him and reached into his pocket. My heart sank as I felt his pocket knife. Panic erupted in the room as about 5 people tried to take it from me. The last thing I remember was thrusting the knife into my stomach, feeling a blinding pain before everything went black. Hours later, I began to wake up. Everything was blurry and fuzzy. I could faintly hear someone telling me to relax. As minutes passed, things became a bit clearer. I looked around and realized I was in a large room with a few other patients. A nurse was moving from bed to bed, checking on them. I tried to sit up to get more comfortable, and noticed a sharp soreness in my stomach. Moving my hospital gown aside, I saw a huge scar about 6 inches across. Most of it looked surgical, like a C-section incision. But where I remembered the knife entering, there were extra stitches. It was also quite bruised. I imagined that a dull, old knife shoved into my body wouldn't have cut cleanly, leaving more damage. The initial shock from seeing my stomach faded quickly when I realized whatever was inside me was now gone. I didn't hear the voice anymore, didn't feel the hand in my gut, and the awful kicking sensation was gone. I felt like I could finally breathe. I asked the nurse what they had found, and she looked embarrassed. That's something your doctor will discuss with you once you've eaten and can speak clearly, she said, quickly leaving the room. Shortly after, I was wheeled into a recovery room where my parents joined me. When they walked in, they had the same distressed look as the nurse. They looked pale and avoided eye contact. I kept asking them what was happening, but they said the doctor needed to talk to me and wanted to ensure I wasn't still affected by the anesthesia. The doctor didn't visit me for another 10 hours, which felt odd. To add to the strangeness, my parents were taking turns staying with me. There was only a brief overlap when they switched, with one parent leaving as the other arrived. I would understand if they didn't both stay the entire time, but they were only both in my room together for about an hour, the hour before the doctor finally came. When the doctor entered to talk to me, the room felt cold and silent. It was clear he didn't share my sense of relief. He seemed awkward, speaking too long before addressing me directly. He pulled a chair close and sat down. "Listen, Jake. I know the past 24 hours have been extremely challenging. I apologize for not explaining what happened during your surgery sooner, but we needed time to figure things out and process everything. We believe we now have enough information to explain what's going on," he said, leaving a heavy silence in the room. "And?" I responded, confused. "I think it would be easier if we just show you." The doctor, along with my parents, helped me into a wheelchair, and we began moving across the hospital to a different section. I couldn't believe the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind about what we were about to see. It felt like cruel and unusual punishment to keep me in suspense instead of telling me up front. As we turned the corner, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. I initially thought they were showing me a large tumor or growth, but why would a tumor be housed in a big incubation chamber with tubes connected to IVs and various machines? As I got closer, I saw something resembling a human figure on it. It was mostly just a 6-pound lump of flesh, but I could see a hand protruding from it. It was small, but eerie because it looked like a fully developed man's hand, complete with a patch of hair where its head should be and a few scattered teeth. It had no clear facial features. Watching it with disgust and coming to terms with the fact that this thing was once inside me, I had a realization. I wasn't feeling sick at the thought of something being in my body. Sure, I was grossed out that this particular thing had been inside me, but thinking about bacteria or my blood pumping through my veins didn't make me feel sick. I felt normal. Not only were the voice and kicking gone, but my OCD was too. I realized I didn't have a mental illness. It was just this thing trying to escape for years. As I stared at the creature, the doctor approached and placed his hand on my shoulder. "We believe this is your twin brother," he began. I immediately looked up at my parents, who looked deeply disturbed and upset. I let him continue. "We think you absorbed him in the womb, and that he has been living inside you your entire life. This is an extremely rare condition called fetus infantu. It appears he didn't have the best chance to develop normally, which is why he looks the way he does. Despite his appearance, he has all the necessary organs to survive. It seems he's missing a lung and his gallbladder, and a piece of his liver, but otherwise, he could live for a few more years. He won't be able to leave this room because he needs a feeding tube and other support that his body can't manage on its own. He requires a lot of assistance to stay alive. What makes this situation exceptionally unique is that your twin is still alive even though your body can no longer sustain him. Although we have him connected to several IVs and machines, it's inexplicable how he remains alive outside of your body. I was completely shocked and didn't want to believe it. I asked my mom why she never told me I had absorbed my twin in the womb. She said she had no idea and that there were no signs when she was pregnant with me. He also mentioned that sometimes, even during pregnancies, women can carry a baby without showing a noticeable belly. It's called a cryptic pregnancy. I've always had a bit of a gut, but never enough to cause suspicion. I guess in my case, I had fetus in fetu and an experience similar to a cryptic pregnancy, even though it was in my stomach. At least, that was the doctor's best guess, though it all sounded like nonsense to me. The doctor and my parents continued to explain more details, but I didn't understand why they didn't slow down for my sake. How could they not see that I wasn't processing any of this? I noticed something as they tried to explain things to me. They kept referring to it as a he. Now listen, I'm not someone who disrespects people's preferred pronouns. I've never been that kind of person. But this is where I draw the line. Not only that, but this thing had a name. My parents had named it, and said today was its birthday. While they provided all this information, they didn't look happy. It seemed like they were forced into saying all this nonsense. And now it was my turn to be convinced. I could tell they were trying to push it on me. The doctor told me that even though it didn't have a high chance of a long life, we should still try to give it the love it deserves. Of course, he referred to it as a he, but I refused to accept that. This disgusted me. This thing had tried to kill me and ruin my quality of life for so long, and now we were going to treat it like some kind of prince? Absolutely not. Luckily, it seemed like it would never leave the hospital, but my parents planned to visit it daily. Visit it? Are you kidding me? It had no eyes, no ears. It was probably miserable and didn't understand that people were around it. I refused to ever see this thing again or acknowledge its existence. I could get in trouble for even talking about this. The hospital and everyone involved had signed NDAs to keep this information confidential until it officially died. They wanted to conduct proper research on this medical anomaly before making any public statements. I just had to get this all off my chest. I felt like I was the crazy one here, even though I knew I wasn't. I didn't care if I got in trouble. I was scared that the doctors were pressuring my parents into giving this thing a proper life. I think that's why it took them so long to tell me. I believe they intimidated my parents into keeping it alive, making them feel guilty, or even forcing them to be its parents. I'm all for every life being important and all that, but I have a feeling my parents are terrified of this thing just like I am. I'm convinced they gaslit my parents into believing this thing is my brother. If there were no signs of him while my mom was pregnant with me, could this thing be something else? This all happened about 2 years ago. It's still alive, and they are still researching it. My parents continue to visit it despite everything. My therapist told me that I'm probably just struggling with jealousy now that I'm not an only child anymore, and so much of my parents' attention is on him. But it's so much bigger than just jealousy. Since this thing appeared and my OCD is almost completely gone, I've barely seen my parents. I know I'm not just jealous. There's something more to this. I know it. Something just feels so off about this whole situation. What is this thing? Where did it come from? And what does it want?